Lenny.
Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to episode 88 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
We like to dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the front porch.
Lenny, I have a Hollywood update.
You do? What is it?
I have heard that Remarkably Bright Creatures is going to be filmed.
Really?
Yep.
Did they have the actress and the actors picked out for this?
I believe Sally Field will play the lead.
What?
Isn't that great?
Oh, wow. Yeah, she'll do a good job as the lead in that.
Mm-hmm. And it will be on Netflix, apparently.
Oh, did it say when it's going to air?
No, I don't think they have even started filming it yet. They have the director. The director will be Olivia Newman, and she was the director for Where the Crawdads Sing.
Oh.
So someone with experience in these wonderful, strong female protagonist movies. I am looking forward to that. And I was thinking about when we interviewed Shelby, she must have known things were in the works, but of course she would not have been able to tell us.
Oh, yeah.
But so exciting for her. And was she not one of the loveliest people to talk to? I'm so happy for her that she's having this success.
That is so awesome. What was an enjoyable book, wasn't it?
It sure was.
Well, today we talk about Things Fall Apart. We interview Thomas Jay Lynn, and what I think people are really going to like about listening to this podcast is his level of expertise, not only in African literature, but in this author and other works that this author has done that shed light into that kind of time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Dr. Thomas Jay Lynn, or Tom, as he invited us to call him, is Associate Professor of English and Program Chair of the Associate Degree in Multidisciplinary Studies and member of the Global Studies faculty at Penn State Berks. His teaching and scholarly interests include African, world, and ancient literatures, as well as the music of the Beatles. Lynn's book, Chinua Achebe and the Politics of Narration, Envisioning Language, was published in 2017 by Palgrave Macmillan, and his other writings on African literature have been published in many refereed journals and numerous books. In 2020, Lynn was elected to the Northeast Modern Language Association Board of Directors as the British and Global Anglophone Studies Director. He was awarded the 2021 Penn State University Comparative Literature Sidney Abul Hossein Award for making, quote, a decisive contribution to students' study of literature in a global context. Lynn's other African literature publications include 11 articles, 1 book chapter, and many encyclopedia entries on Chinua Achebe, including a chapter-length entry on Achebe's second novel, No Longer at Ease.
Great. Well, let's get to it.
Welcome, Tom, to the front porch.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Lenny.
Yeah, well, we're so pleased to have you today. We want to talk to you about Things Fall Apart. But first, we'd like to know, how did you get interested in African literature?
I actually believe that I arrived at African literatures somewhat through Native American and Indian, that is, South Asian Indian literatures, because I had become interested in Indian literature. I teach a course on the Beatles, and when I was in my formative years, interesting things seemed to be happening in India, like when the Beatles went to India. And so it was sort of percolating, and then I did a Fulbright summer seminar in India in the early 90s, and I wasn't a professor or anything then, and I thought, I want to become a professor. I would like to teach literature like this. When I got to my graduate program, my advisor, someone whom I had a lot of courses with, Keith Booker, was all about literature from around the world. It was being called, and I guess to some extent still is, post-colonial literature. And somehow one thing led to another, and I was studying African literature with him. And also, I had studied the previous semester Native American literature, which has a long tradition of the trickster figure. In Things Fall Apart, there is a fairly long traditional Igbo story about the tortoise and the birds who give the tortoise his feathers, and he flies for a while, and then he purloins their food at the feast in the sky.
Yeah.
And he falls to the earth and his shell cracks, and it's what's called an etiological story. It's an explanation of why turtles have cracks in their shells. So Tortoise is a really prominent trickster figure in West African literature. But I didn't really know that at the time. All I know is that we were reading Things Fall Apart in grad school. I saw this trickster story. I had studied in Native American literature, and I had that light go off because I was already trying to think, what am I going to do for my dissertation, and all that stuff that was still in the distance. And I saw that trickster story. It reminded me of the Native American trickster. And I thought to myself, there's got to be something to do with this. I mean, this looks really rich and valuable. And sure enough, I ended up doing that. And because of my advisor and just my burgeoning interest in Chinua Achebe, I then focused on African literature.
Who were some of the Native American authors that you studied?
Louise Erdrich.
Oh, sure.
Leslie Silko, and Scott Momaday is a very central figure in modern Native American novels. And also we read a famous book called Black Elk Speaks, but that's a wonderful book too. And also there was a book called Finding the Center, which was a transcription by Dennis Tedlock of modern Zuni storytellers, Zuni Indian tales. And Tedlock also is sort of a foundational figure in modern sort of anthropology, which is showing the connections to the traditional literatures and orature. So we covered a lot in that class, but it seemed to be a springboard for me to find out more about oral literatures in Africa and then combine them with my understanding of some of the modern literature.
You've written a book about Chinua Achebe called Chinua Achebe and the Politics of Narration, Envisioning Language. What was it about Achebe's work that inspired you to write this book that has been praised as astute, meticulous, and fresh in its focus, and a notable contribution to Achebe studies?
I'll say two things in answer to that. One is that, of course, some of the interest and writing was derived from my doctoral program, because Things Fall Apart was the focus of one of the chapters of my dissertation. Although that chapter is not in the book exactly, but there are parts of it that I drew on. But also something else, there was a period there, I don't know that we're in it anymore though, but and I base this on totally anecdotal evidence of what my students are telling me, but there was a period there where Chinua Achebe was the African author, at least in English language studies.
Mm-hmm.
When I was growing up and as a young professional, I had to read again and again and again Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
Right.
It was assigned to me in high school, in college, in graduate school. It was even assigned to me when I was a high school teacher. You got to teach this book. And I think that one of the reasons people just were assigning that book all over the place is because they wanted something set elsewhere than the United States and England.
Mm-hmm.
But in my opinion, there's a lot of problems with Heart of Darkness. And I think that what ended up happening is that Things Fall Apart started supplanting Heart of Darkness as the novel set in Africa that school students would read. And in fact, and I don't know this is related very much at all, but in fact, perhaps the most famous thing that Chinua Achebe ever wrote, other than Things Fall Apart, is not his other novels, which are all great, by the way, but a lecture that he gave that became a famous article on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Then it's called Racism in Heart of Darkness, and remains very controversial because, for one thing, to have someone tear down the reputation of Joseph Conrad can get people upset.
Right.
But Things Fall Apart became a kind of go-to novel. And therefore, among other things that happened, people in the early 2000s were getting very interested in Things Fall Apart, very interested in Chinua Achebe's novels and some of his other writing, but mainly his novels. Because I had published a bunch of entries in an encyclopedia on Chinua Achebe and other scholarship about Achebe, I started getting asked to write chapters for books and things like that. And so by the 2012 or so, I realized I possibly have enough diverse writings on Achebe that I could start bringing them together in a book. And that's where it came from.
Well, you talked a little bit about his other work. Are you familiar with his nonfiction work?
To some extent, I am. I haven't read all of them, but I'd say the most famous one is the very last book he wrote. It's called There Was a Country. It's called a memoir. It published right before he died in 2013. And another subtitle was A Memoir of Biafra. So a lot of his personal writings after the first 4 novels, in one way or another, connected to the whole tragedy of what happened in Biafra, which he became part of. He also wrote 2 excellent books that brought together different essays that he had written about literature, about Africa, about the place of the novelist in modern literature. And I've read a lot of those essays.
Are there any others you would recommend for people interested in Achebe's views, either political views, cultural views?
If you're really interested in his political and cultural orientation, I would say There Was a Country.
Okay.
Because before he even gets to the Biafra War, he talks about the whole process of going from being a British colony, which was an experience not just of Nigeria, although he's most familiar with Nigeria. I mean, most of Africa was colonized by European powers. And so he documents how it was a colony, and then it gained independence from Great Britain in 1960, just a few years after he graduated from college. So his whole career, his whole life in a way, is a sort of document of the transition of many, many countries, many societies, from being vassal states of European powers to being independent African nations. And his whole biography is tied up in that. For 10 chapters before he even gets to the Biafra War, in There Is a Country, he talks about that. So that would be the one that I probably would recommend.
He did become involved in political action, the Biafran War, and in many ways, he's a political writer as well. He once said, and I'm going to quote him, "Things are generally all right from a Western point of view. That's because the West runs the world. But from the view of Africa and third world countries, the world is upside down and needs to be totally reordered. When people say my books are too political, this is the reason." You have a master's of social work with a concentration in policy and planning. By the way, I have a bachelor's degree in urban and regional planning, and Lenny has a master's degree in counseling. So we're all kind of swimming in the same territory there. Do you think it was your interest in policy and planning that intersected with your interest in Achebe? Because he is very political. He's very rooted in cultural and societal issues. So tell us about him as a political person and your interest in that.
I feel as though a good book is somehow helping to make the world a good place. And if I don't feel that that's what the book is doing, it doesn't get as high a rating from me. I feel that books are meant to contribute to the good of the world. So yes, I feel as though I've never actually even said this or thought about it before, but going back to our discussion about how did I get interested in African literature and Chinua Achebe, I think that all of a sudden I had an awareness of an area, post-colonial literature, post-colonial studies, that was trying to make the world a better place. And so, yes, I'd say it's part of my DNA.
I'm wondering the impact that this book then had on England. Was there a positive outcome to this book coming out?
I think so. I think that it had a really positive impact. I don't want to overstate the case here, but I think Things Fall Apart will always be considered a masterpiece of world literature. Partly it's just because I've been so immersed in it. And even this semester, I taught it a few weeks ago. In the course that I teach it in, mostly not in relation to modern literature, post-colonial literature, I teach it in relation to the Odyssey and Gilgamesh and Antigone. I think it's that level of mytho-poetic literature that will stand the test of time. And I think that it already has. But it's also politically relevant because a lot of people would say to this day, what we've got is a world that went through a very long period of colonialism, and it's still impacting every aspect of life, whether we want to see it or not. And so this one little book is doing something that seems like, duh, I mean, why didn't people think of that before? But it's absolutely crucial, and more or less it hadn't been done before, which is telling the story of colonialism in Africa from the perspective of an African. Mm-hmm. There had been tons of great books about Africa, including, if you can think of Heart of Darkness, it is telling about colonialism in Africa, but it's telling it from the European perspective. Mm-hmm. And the European perspective for the Europeans was all that was needed. That's the perspective. But Achebe says, wait a second, what happened is this. When he was in college, or it may have been high school, I think it was in college though, a book came out by a famous Anglo-Irish author named Joyce Carey. People aren't really reading him very much anymore, but he was quite a prominent literary figure in the 40s and 50s, I think. And he wrote a book called Mr. Johnson. This novel was supposed to be a very authentic view of what life is like in West Africa. And it's set in Nigeria, not the part of Nigeria that Achebe is from, but anyhow, it's set in Nigeria. Achebe read it as a college student, and he thought, this is such a biased perspective, like Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The people being portrayed here are not the people I know. And I live in Nigeria, and I grew up here, and I was born here. And somebody ought to write a book from the inside. That's the terminology he used, from the inside. And this is what I teach my students is, I think that what he meant by that, first and foremost, or at least very prominently, is someone who understands African languages. Because you can't really get at what people are thinking and feeling and doing. Conrad certainly didn't. In Heart of Darkness, they speak in monosyllabic grunts, the African characters do, because he didn't know African languages. So Achebe is saying someone ought to write about this from the inside. And that was maybe a few years before he started writing Things Fall Apart. And I don't know if this was entirely Achebe's plan. This little novel, in my opinion, is sort of speaking back to the cosmopolitan center, back to Europe. And this is what colonialism was like for us. Mm-hmm. And I just want to add one asterisk to that, going back to that wonderful quote of Achebe saying the world looks pretty good from your vantage point. He also said, and it may have even been in the very same essay, I'm not quite sure, that it's not really fair to sort of pigeonhole my novels as political, because when you live in the context that I do, this is what people talk about. This isn't just political, this is life. Because the people that he rubbed shoulders with and that he grew up with and so forth, the very smart people. He went to the elite schools of the day in Nigeria, British-sponsored schools to some extent. And he wants to make the world a better place. He's saying, how can I not bring out in my books what is important to what our lives are like? So, therefore, it makes sense that he would write about colonialism and the end of a traditional village culture in much of Africa. That's what fell apart, but there's other ways of interpreting that title as well.
Lenny and I debated the benefits and drawbacks of the end of village life. Lenny astutely pointed out that the missionaries in Christianity provided a haven for those that were otherwise outcast from the village. I more concentrated on the cultural and economic drawbacks. Achebe perhaps responds to both of us when 6 months before his death, he said, quote, "The legacy of colonialism is not a simple one, but one of great complexity with contradictions, good things as well as bad. You write about the duality of the Igbo culture. Tell us about this and whether you think that that duality influenced Achebe's representation of colonialism and its results."
I didn't know that quotation. However, I will tell you that he said those same things in somewhat different words 2 or 3 times. And I refer to earlier, much earlier in his career. And I actually refer to one or two of them in the book. That is such a good insight, Nancy. Thank you for that. I absolutely agree that the duality that was part not only of Achebe's outlook on things, but that he says, it's pretty clear, is drawing from his Igbo upbringing. He absolutely emphasizes that there's a certain dualism in how Igbo philosophy looks at everything. But I never totally put that together. What I did put together is that what is extremely important to understand about Achebe is that he is not outright condemning British colonialism, and he is not outright defending it either. He is showing that it had horrible aspects to it, but he also said, including in the quote you said, it had its benefits. There'd be some people out there who would deny the benefits. They might say these are very short-term, very superficial for what Africa really went through and needed. But he didn't. And in fact, he was accused. He was sort of routinely disapproved of for showing anything good or saying anything good about the. But Achebe was not an ideologue. What he was someone who looked at the full picture and saw the weaknesses and the strength, but it wasn't through what most of us understand. It wasn't through an ideological lens. And he got criticized for being on the fence about too many things. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think he was on the fence, but I do think the duality, and thank you again for that it was part of his DNA, allowed him to see the costs and benefits of colonialism.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strengths that I like most about the book, is that it wasn't just a black and white view of what was happening and the political part of it. I think he brought out a lot of the strengths and some of the big mistakes that were made along the way. But before we get through this book, I do have a question about the women in this book. They were not in a position of power. They were kind of underneath, but they had a significant role. What can you tell us about the women and the culture back then?
Well, I wished and regretted that I hadn't included a specific chapter on women in the book that I wrote. And it really had a sharp edge to it, precisely because the first article that I published after the book, a few years later, actually, but it was a long article. It was first published in 2021, is about the women in Achebe's books. It focuses on his fourth novel, A Man of the People. But then I spread it out and I draw on what he's saying in Things Fall Apart and others, even though the focus is A Man of the People. So I am absolutely fascinated by his portrayal of women, even though his treatment of women in his fiction does not have a separate chapter. I will say that if you look in the index, there is an entry in the index about Achebe's positive treatment of women. Here's the thing. There was a period there before I was an Achebe scholar, before I was probably even doing my doctoral program, but not that long before. There was a period, let's say in the 80s, when Achebe was already quite a famous author, that a lot of people were criticizing his portrayal of women. And I really didn't know about that. It wasn't the scholarship that I was focusing on, but little by little, it leaks through to me at conferences and things that I read, that there's somehow this idea that Achebe is against women. And every time I came up against that, my attitude, my knee-jerk response was, have you actually read the books? Because he's not against women. It's just that he tells the truth. And the truth is, they were treated like crap a lot of the time. But to extrapolate from that he was against women, because what he's doing is he's saying this is a very patriarchal culture. Women are obedient and subservient. But what he's also saying, and this is to his great credit, in my opinion, is women are always, nevertheless, essential to what happens in people's lives. And they find workarounds for the disempowered treatment they get. And it's even there in Things Fall Apart, although he draws that out even more in later novels. But if you can think of the scene, for example, where the little girl gets taken away by the priestess. Well, first of all, that's a priestess. She's got a certain amount of power. And even Okonkwo doesn't mess with her up to a point. But the person who's been taking the lead in following her daughter with the priestess and making sure that no harm comes to her is Okonkwo's wife, Ikwefi. And even when Okonkwo tells her to go home, she says, I'm not going home until we have our daughter back. So the thing that is true about Achebe's treatment of women is that until his final novel, which was published many years, like 21 years, and the Biafran War came in between and all this stuff, but it's not until that novel, which is called Anthills of the Savannah, that you really have a female character that could be called a protagonist. And she's not even quite a protagonist. She's one of the important characters, but there's two other male characters that are equally important. So in the first four novels, women are not central, at least on a superficial level, to the plot. Men are. And so that criticism I kind of get, and I don't think that you can dismiss that. Achebe did not focus his first four novels on a female character, but within that limitation, man, does he, in my opinion, do a great job of showing how important women are and also showing the disgraceful way that they're treated. So I commend him for his powerful treatment of women, even though they're not the prominent characters in the first four novels.
I really looked at this from a historical point of view of it being a patriarchal society. I never felt like that was him as the author saying anything about that. But one of the parts of the book that stood out for me is the value of women in the culture was enough that the one lady's family who was beaten and not treated well by her husband, they came and said to her husband, you broke this marriage vow a long time ago. You're not going to abuse her anymore. We're taking her back to our village. And I thought, well, there you go. There was a respect for women then.
I'm so glad you said that. That really is Exhibit A in a way. That is such an important scene. And when I teach the book, and as I say, I taught it just a few weeks ago, my students don't realize what an important scene that is. It's a little bit of an Achebe joke in a way, in the way it's contextualized, because what you're supposed to see is the massive case before the Igbo, the jurors, about a land dispute. And he actually talks about that land dispute in Arrow of God, another novel. But no, what becomes front and center is a man that is beating his wife within an inch of her life routinely. And the brothers say, you can't get her back. And then finally, the Gugu say, you have to restore the wife to the man. But beating a woman is not how you show masculinity, which I think is incredible. You don't show how tough a man you are by beating a woman. And then the brothers add a little bit of a cherry to the cupcake there. They say, and if you beat her again, we're going to castrate you.
Yeah.
So you tell me who else in their first novel about Nigeria would have included a scene like that. I just think for 1958, when the book was published, I think it's incredible that a scene like that is in that story.
I think that's a powerful scene in the book as well.
One of the things I was intrigued about in reading Things Fall Apart is that Achebe wrote about a very flawed protagonist. There were a lot more likable and even more moral characters, but he focuses on Okonkwo and tells the story of his people as they first encounter British imperialism through him, not through one of the more likable characters. Why do you think he did that?
I am so glad you asked that question, because really it gets right into something I had meant to say earlier, but also the heart of what we're talking about, the Igbo dualistic philosophy and all that.
Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting thing about Things Fall Apart, that not only is his protagonist a very flawed, objectionable man, even to his neighbors.
Right.
If Achebe on some level is writing Things Fall Apart as a reply to the hundreds of books written about Africa from a European perspective, and this is his little modest reply, then why does he include such a negative well, he's not completely negative, but objectionable in a lot of ways, Okonkwo, And also scenes like Okonkwo drinking palm wine from the skull of his victims and killing his adoptive son who calls him father. And why did Achebe include those things? I pretend that I'm Achebe's 1958 literary agent, and I say, Chinua, you got a really good book here. This is going to have some sales, but couldn't you lose some of those scenes like Okonkwo shooting at his wife? Because if your idea is that you're writing back to the Cosmopolitan Center and rebutting decades and centuries of prejudice against Africa, why do you want to include unglamorous situations like this?
Right.
I think that the answer is, first of all, he's saying, I've read hundreds of books about Africa, and they're not telling the truth. They're not telling the truth about Africa. So I'm going to write my book. And I am not going to flatter Africa either. What if I did something that was really radical and tell the truth? Just tell it like it is. And I have enough confidence in the integrity and the beauty of this culture, warts and all, that it will make a very good story and tell us something important about life, which I think it does. So I think that is also Okonkwo. Sure, he could have written the story with Obiorika as the protagonist, who I think you may have been referring to.
Yeah.
He's a good dude. He's an accomplished man. And he's not as oppressive, and he's not as much of an authoritarian as Okonkwo is. But I think this is the duality that we're talking about. Achebe is basically saying, so I'm going to tell the truth in this story. And how do I get at the truth? Through dualism, just as you were saying. So I'm going to show Okonkwo, who's not a glamorous hero. He's got really great qualities, but man, he's got objectionable ones too. And I'm going to let you figure it out from there. Well, he's telling you a lot about it, but he has a tragic hero at the center of his story. And there have been authors who have pointed out that Things Fall Apart reads like a Greek tragedy in some ways. And if you think about Oedipus in Oedipus Rex or some of these other Greek figures, Creon and so forth, these are not saintly guys either.
That's a good point.
You teach African literature, and we've talked about this book being a classic and him staying really true to the culture of the people. What do you think his books and he are saying to students at Penn State in this century?
Wow. So you weren't going to let me get off easy today, huh, Lenny? I teach at Penn State Berks, which is a branch college of Penn State University. And I have a very wide range of students. I have students who really have traveled and have a sense of the world, and I have students who don't read and very much at all. I mean, they're at Penn State, so they must have done some reading, but reading even an American novel would not be on their to-do list and so forth. And the reason I'm saying that is not to put down or praise anybody, just to say that what this book means to my students is very hard for me to gauge, because some of them are taking it at a level that others are not. Okay, but I do feel that by the end of our study of Things Fall Apart, a certain percentage of the students are coming on board with what I think, if you're only going to read one African novel, that you can draw from this book. And it's not a happy ending, right? It's not very sexy, a couple of scenes, but basically that's not it either. But what it does do is give you the stimulation of a new awareness that people on this planet are walking around that have a valid and beautiful perspective on life that isn't in some ways like ours. That Achebe draws you into a kind of, not an alternate reality, because that would be condescending, but a different culture, a different way of looking at things, a different set of values. One of the optional questions on the essay about Things Fall Apart was, can a woman be fulfilled and happy in this culture? And one of the students wrote something really, which I thought was really true and important, which is, sure, they can, because their expectations of what would be fulfilling and what they are oriented to, if they get those things like having children and selling hoes in the marketplace, like weeding instruments for the farming and telling stories at bedtime, then yeah, they'd be pretty fulfilled. It wouldn't be nice to have a husband that beats you, but so I hope they get a little bit of that out of it. And plus, on top of all of that, there is a spiritual aspect to the book, which I believe is profoundly wise. And he talks somewhat about Igbo religious beliefs and the idea of the chi. I'll just side note, but I think it's very significant, which is that they made a video of an interview he did around 1999 or so. And he talks about how, in fact, the chi is about an aspect of Igbo religion that he doesn't address in Things Fall Apart, but is really tied and very important, which is the Igbo traditional religion has the concept of reincarnation, and that each new life that we have the same chi, but we're a different reality, a different body and everything, but the same soul. So our soul follows us through successive lifetimes. So even though it's not in Things Fall Apart, the reason I'm mentioning it is that I think there's a profound spiritual dimension. And he said in that video, Okonkwo is a very positive figure in a lot of ways because he does things that the Igbo people admire. He works hard. He starts from nothing, like the American dream, and ultimately has more yams in his barn than anybody else. He's the most successful warrior, the most successful wrestler. But even by Igbo standards, he went too far against the female energy. Everything related to female was second rate or worse because of his obsession with being a manly man that Unoka, his father, was not.
Mm-hmm.
The Igbo people see everything in a balance, and he was imbalanced in the way that he treated the female principal. That's what Achebe says in that video.
Wow.
Interesting.
It is interesting that the eventual crime that he commits, the accidental shooting of a fellow villager, Achebe says it's considered a female crime.
Yeah.
And so that's what does him in.
Isn't that interesting? Oh, man, there you go. I hadn't thought of that. Wow.
Yeah.
That is so true, because it really does highlight what Achebe says in that interview,
Mm-hmm.
that in killing that boy, it's showing his violation of the female principle.
Mm-hmm.
And I will also mention, too, that is such a good insight. I will also mention that because he was so obsessed about suppressing anything related to the female.
Yep.
So when he does kill Ikemefuna, he starts self-medicating and he says, Okonkwo, when did you decide to become a woman? Because in fact, he's not a sociopath. He does have tender feelings, as he does, for example, his daughter Ezinma, but he brutally suppresses them. So how did he get that way? Well, partly it's because he was shamed by his father, Unoka, who was at one time called a woman because he was lazy and he didn't farm well. And so he, at a very early age, took what we all go through at one point or another. Like, I'm not going to be anything like my parent. And then put it on steroids. But at the end of the novel, he ends up having to be buried in the same place Unoka is buried.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
I didn't catch that either. That is so good.
In the evil forest.
Oh, that's right. It was the evil forest.
Right.
He gets buried in the desecrated land because he commits suicide. But this takes us back to Greek tragedy. The further that one runs from one's fate or destiny, the more one seals it.
Wow.
Oh,
That
that's
is
really
that
good
is good. That definitely brings us back to where you situate this book in your classic literature as well.
As far as I know, the oldest, more or less complete heroic epic is the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Right.
from ancient Mesopotamia. And I think that Okonkwo is in some ways quite close to Gilgamesh from what I've read, and I think I've read Achebe talk about this, I don't think that he was consciously at all trying to write something akin to a Greek tragedy. But for example, you know that when that boy is shot at the funeral, they have to go into 7 years of exile. And this just tears Okonkwo apart. Well, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is on Calypso's island for 7 years.
Right.
And this tears him apart. That the hero going into exile and so forth, and then trying to come back as Odysseus does,
right,
to reassert himself. Okonkwo does the same thing. He tries to reassert himself in Umuofia, but it doesn't work because the British are there.
Mm-hmm.
And he probably would have, but the British are there. And that's a force that he doesn't have the wherewithal to contend with. Yeah. So it's not the same story as those stories, but I hope that what I'm getting across is I feel that it has the virtues of those stories. I really do feel that it can be ranked right there with them. I feel as though we could be talking about the Odyssey and Gilgamesh 200 years from now and legitimately talking about Things Fall Apart as well. One of the differences is that it's not epic poetry, it's prose. And by the way, I don't want to leave this podcast without mentioning that one controversial point about Achebe and Achebe's work. It's controversial. It doesn't bother me, but it bothers a lot of people. And it's been a topic from almost when he first became famous, when Things Fall Apart and the sequel to it, No Longer at Ease, came out, which is, how can you call this African literature when it's written in a colonial language? You wouldn't call Homer Greek literature if it was written in French. You wouldn't call Shakespeare English literature if it was written in Latin. How can you call this African literature? And Achebe responded on numerous levels, but I think his core point, and one that I accept, is that if he had written it in Igbo, which he could have easily done, that's his mother tongue, who could have read it? Certainly not the people in England, whom partly he was writing for. There's dozens of languages in Nigeria alone. How many of those people speak Igbo?
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't have gotten out. Now, of course, you could say, well, write it in Igbo and then get it translated. And another famous African novelist did that eventually after writing a bunch of novels in English. His name is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. They knew each other. They were friendly rivals, actually. But the thing is, even with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he had to get famous to get people to start translating his work. If he had written in Igbo, who would have translated it into English?
Right.
So I think that this is one of those situations which is not exactly parallel to classic ancient literature or whatever. You have this reality of colonialism that brought English into Nigeria and became the language that all educated people spoke to communicate with each other. So I think it's valid that he writes in English, but it is a controversial point.
I was reading that he is seen as someone, however, who takes the Igbo language and translates its cadence, the way of speaking, the syntax in a way that had never been done before. Is that right?
Absolutely revolutionary aspect to that novel, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely revolutionary. That he found a way of writing a book in English, but that also imparts some degree of an Igbo sensibility. Yes, I feel like somewhere I've read or maybe even wrote, and I don't know if it was in the book or somewhere else, that there's like a famous line in one of his novels, a really powerful line, an important line, that is said in a way, it's in English, but it's said in a way that we would not say it. Mm-hmm. That it's said with a word order and therefore a cadence that would be Igbo, even though it's in English. And I really wish I had it at my fingertips. But yes, I think that he did that. But what he also did is that he portrayed the use of language as Igbo people use it, even though it's in English. For example, there's an early scene that's meant to illustrate that Unoka, Okonkwo's dad, did not pay back his loans. So one of his neighbors who had loaned him some money sometime before goes to see him to get that money back because he wants to purchase a new rank in the village. And before he gets to the nub of the matter, they start talking in proverbial language to each other. And so you have to follow all these proverbs, which are beautiful and interesting, but they're not on point. And finally, the guy gets to the point, and then Unoka answers with even more proverbs.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both sort of skirting the issue, but they're also finding a way into the issue. And this is all done through proverbial language. In English, we understand it and everything, but it's giving you the manner of how Igbo people speak.
Yeah.
So on that level, I would say, is it English? Yes. But is it portraying really effectively aspects of how Igbo language works? I would say yes to that too.
Yeah, fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
What are you working on next that we should be looking for? Your scholarship is so interesting. I feel like we could talk for days about this. I know you've also written about contemporary African novelists, but what's on the horizon for you?
I'm a little bit self-conscious about saying it because it's been slow in evolving, and I've got maybe 60 to 75 pages of it written, and the editor at Bloomsbury wants to know where it is. And she wants me to have it to her by April, so we'll see. I'm going to try. But it's another book, and it's called Women's Abandonment, Illness and Healing, Trauma and Testimony in African Literature.
Wow.
Excellent.
Wow, that sounds interesting.
So I guess the social work thing is coming out there.
Oh, yeah. Very interesting.
And it does have one Achebe novel that is going to be a pretty substantial part of one of the chapters. Some of the chapters are just oriented to a single novel, but one of the early chapters is maybe 2 or 3 early Nigerian novels, and one of them is Achebe's almost a sequel to Things Fall Apart. It's called No Longer at Ease. And for my money, and not everybody feels this way, but for my money, it's equally good as Things Fall Apart. Not everybody feels that way, but it's not set in the traditional society. It's the protagonist is Okonkwo's grandson, Obi Okonkwo, and he's a modern man. And so the story revolves around him, but his father, who had been Noya in Things Fall Apart, is in it.
Right.
And references are made to Okonkwo. So I love that book. And the protagonist's mother is one of the female characters that I focus on, that she becomes ill at a certain point. We really don't know why, but we do feel that on some level she's suffering from abandonment. It's not just abandonment and illness. There's also transcendence and so forth. So it's a book about 7 or 8 different African novels and the topic of illness and healing.
Excellent. Is Achebe's work the earliest African novels that you cover?
Great question. The answer is no, but it's still pretty early. There had been a South African writer. Now I'm talking about Black writers. And I believe there was a Black South African writer who put out a novel, and I can't think of his name right now, but really obscure. It's not well known at all. Then in the early to mid 50s, a Nigerian writer named Cyprian Ekwenzi wrote a book called People of the City that is set in Nigeria. And Ekwenzi was also Igbo, and Achebe and Ekwenzi became friends, actually. But the book that really made the international impression that people were talking about it and teaching in schools and so forth, that was Things Fall Apart.
Yeah.
It was early, but it wasn't the earliest.
Yeah. And then what's the most current novel that you focus on?
When I said at the beginning of this interview that Achebe is sort of at the forefront of a burgeoning of African literature, I can't keep track of all that's going on. Every day it seems like a new masterpiece is coming out. The most recent ones that I am focusing on, this is one of them. It's called Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. She's not Igbo, but rather Yoruba, originally from Nigeria. And that was first published in 2017, I believe. The other one that I want to highlight, and she has become very possibly the most famous African novelist of the last 20 years. Not just female novelist, novelist. Achebe knew her before he died, and he admired her. I don't think he actually knew how prominent she would become, but she hasn't published too many novels. I don't think she's published any novels since around 2013, 2012 that really made a big sensation and is a fantastic book. It's called Americana, and it's about a woman who goes back and forth between Nigeria and the United States and sees the different cultural perspectives and her love interests and so forth. It's fantastic. But for my personal money, her previous novel before that is one of my all-time favorite books called Half of a Yellow Sun. This is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's also Igbo. In fact, the home she grew up in was, for a while, Achebe's home many years earlier. Kind of a coincidence, but nevertheless, she grew up in Achebe's home, or next door to Achebe's home.
Wow.
So Half of a Yellow Sun, it might sound, if I say this to you, a little bit of a discouraging aspect to it, because in a way, like Achebe's final book, which is not a novel, is about what happened in Biafra, the Biafran War. And this novel has as its sort of main plot line the lead up to and what happened during the Biafra War, but it's about so many other things as well. You know how I was saying about Things Fall Apart? It has a mythic and yet modern novel quality. I think launches it into a sphere that it's going to be read for a long time. And I think the same is true of this. It's just so beautifully written. And the story and the protagonist is so evocative and lovely. It's not that it's like mythic in the way that Things Fall Apart is. You know how certain books strike you as like, oh man, this person's hitting it out of the park. This is just taking me to the stratosphere of quality, of literary quality.
Right.
That book is like that for me.
I read her Americana, and I was swept away by the beauty of her writing. That book to me seemed mostly a meditation on economic differences between the United States and her home country in Africa, and then the economic differences and how people survive in the United States. Of course, the plot, though, is this ongoing on and off relationship she has with her first love, but just a beautiful book. So I'm very interested in Half of the Yellow Sun.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I really liked Americana a lot, and I agree with you. It's beautifully written. So it's just subjective. It's like there's just something about Half of a Yellow Sun, which I just felt like took me to another level of beauty and also tragedy. There's a relationship between sisters in that. That is something that will recommend it for you.
Oh.
The relationship between the main character, Olana, and her sister, Kayanene, is so brilliant. These two sisters, they're alienated from each other because they fight for a while, but then they come back together, and it's like there's some powerful connection between them. So it is tragic, but there's a lot of beauty in it. And interesting about Americana, what you said about the on-again, off-again relationship between Ifemelu and what's his name again?
Oh, I cannot remember.
But here we have a modern novel, clearly a superior literary production on every level, that is about a Nigerian Igbo woman looking for, among other things, the man that most fits with who she wants to be in her life. Can you imagine in the village society that Achebe portrays, a woman having those kinds of options?
Yeah, we have now entered the 21st century with that book, right?
Right.
It has been so delightful to have you on the front porch. What a great conversation. Really appreciate your insights and all of the knowledge that you have brought to Lenny's and my understanding and reading of this book. It's been so fun.
It's sincerely been fun for me. Not only that, but an honor. And you've helped me understand things better than I did before, which I will take with me. And to say that it's been a pleasure is an understatement. It's been a joy.
Oh. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
It was lovely meeting you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy, did you not like talking to him?
That was so fascinating. Really enjoyable.
We got the right person. We really wanted a deeper dive into the culture that was going on there and the behind the scenes. And we got the person to talk to us about that.
I feel like we just had a collegiate seminar level discussion on Things Fall Apart.
I think we did.
Yeah.
I'm glad there was no test at the end. Very knowledgeable. I think it would be interesting to be in his class.
Absolutely. One thing that I learned is that I was pronouncing Igbo incorrectly. I had been pronouncing it Igbo, but Igbo is the name of the people that Chinua Achebe comes from. So that's good to know.
Yeah. And Igbo, I didn't even know that was real.
Oh.
Reading a fiction book, I didn't know that those were actually the name of an actual people.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was learning lots.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things I found really fascinating is how he situates Things Fall Apart along with classical works for his students, because he believes so strongly that this is a book that will stand the test of time.
Yeah, it was interesting parallel, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Amongst those great novels, that this one he believes is going to be a classic. And here I never even heard of it. Just the perfect person for our podcast. We are switching up gears big time.
Right.
This is like a whiplash. Next month, we are going to review Tom Lake. That's written by Ann Patchett.
Yeah, brand new contemporary novel. A woman, probably who's about our age, talking to her adult daughters about what they believe is very glamorous young life as a starlet and her romance with, at the time, someone who was not famous, but an actor who became famous later. And it's set during COVID.
Oh.
And so this is one of the first COVID set novels, I think, that has come out.
Very interesting. Well, I haven't started it yet, but I look forward to it. I love the female fiction, little bit of romance kind of book, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. I'm going to have a hard time switching from Africa, though. I really loved everything about Things Fall Apart. I loved everything about this conversation we had with Tom. But this happens so often. I get so deeply immersed in these books, and our conversations with authors or experts just make me want to stay in the world longer. But no, it's off to our next book.
Off to our next one.
Yeah. I'm about halfway through Tom Lake, and I'm enjoying every moment of it. And I know you will, too.
I'm sure I will.
Well, everyone, thanks for listening. Our website is frontporchbookclub.com.
Our episodes come out twice a month on the first and third Wednesday of each month.
See you next time, Lenny.
Thank you, Nancy. See you later.
Okay.